Today is October 11th, and we're having Professor Marandi with us to talk about what's going on between Iran and Israel. It seems that, welcome back, Professor.
Thank you.
And let's get started with what's going on in Qatar. It seems that there are some activities at the airbase, American airbase in Qatar, and Israel is getting ready to attack Iran. Yesterday, the former Israeli prime minister was talking about that the way that they're going to attack Iran. I'm going to play a clip for you and take your response for what he has.
Thank you so much for joining us here on the program. The world is waiting and watching to see how Israel responds to Iran's ballistic missile strike on Israel last week. What do you think they should do?
I believe that Israel should strike Iran's nuclear program and strike regime centers, and I'll explain why. The ultimate strategy that I believe that the world should have is to not allow to Iran acquire a nuclear weapon ever. And how do you do it? By accelerating the toppling of the regime. It will fall, and ensuring that in the meantime they don't acquire a nuclear weapon. So basically you need two efforts: to accelerate the toppling of the regime and to slow down the acquisition of nuclear weapons.
Does Israel have the capability, though, to do it alone?
Yes. We can strike and cause considerable damage. I don't know if we can destroy the whole program, but as I said, we have to delay it while we accelerate the pace of the toppling of the regime.
Yeah. He's simply saying that. Your response, Professor.
I think it's pretty clear that after a year of genocide in Gaza and the genocidal attacks now in Lebanon, that the Israeli regime has exposed itself in the eyes of global public opinion. And I think in the weeks ahead, that will be very important because for well over 4 decades, the United States and its Western allies have, to a large degree, succeeded in demonizing Iran, especially including among much of the global public. Iran never really had much of a voice. We didn't have alternative media in the past, so Western narratives were always very powerful. And the last year, I believe, although this has begun earlier, but the last year in particular, the world has changed dramatically, and the contempt for the Israeli regime and for its backers has been on the rise everywhere. And therefore, these sort of interviews and these sort of narratives that are being produced and repeated by Western media don't have the sort of impact and influence that they did in the past. In the past, I think if the Israeli prime minister or the Israeli regime's previous prime minister or a foreign minister would make such statements, a lot of people would be nodding their head in agreement. But things have changed. And what we are now seeing is that there's a huge amount of regional and global support for Iran. And I think people now see through this propaganda. So that's, I think, one issue. Um, the Israeli regime, the regime spokesman or previous officials or current officials, when they speak, it only shows that they are lawless and aggressive, and they lash out at whoever they want, and the West will do nothing about it. Every day they're bombing Syria. They just bombed a hospital in Syria, a field hospital for wounded Lebanese. They destroyed the whole hospital. It got no mention in the Western media. They they carried out every day they're carrying out atrocities in Gaza, but the last 2 days in particular were very horrific. And last night they bombed a residential complex in Beirut, killing a large number of people. They pretended that it was to assassinate someone, but that person was never in the building, had never been inside that building before. But the West will always try to provide an excuse or try to justify their behavior, whether it's Western media, Western officials. But it doesn't work like that anymore. So when people see Syria, Lebanon, uh, Gaza, the West Bank, and then now the regime wants to bomb Iran after striking Iran's embassy and assassinating people in Tehran, it only makes the Israeli regime look even more lawless and dangerous and reckless. But the fact is that all of Iran's strategic assets are deep underground. And it's not because of the Israeli regime. The Israeli regime is not a strong regime, it's weak. Its power comes from the United States and the West. Otherwise, if they cut their support, the regime would collapse almost immediately. But still, even with all that support, the Israeli regime does not have the capabilities of the United States. The Iranians built all of its key assets, its vulnerable assets like the nuclear program, uh, key military installations, or key weapons. They put them deep underground to protect them from American airstrikes. Because ever since the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan and the occupation of these two countries, the Iranians have been preparing themselves for a potential war with the United States, an invasion by the United States, because the United States has invaded and destroyed country after country, whether it's Iraq and Afghanistan or Syria and Libya or Yemen or elsewhere. The Iranians know that they have to create a deterrence. So they protected most of their key assets in a way in which the United States cannot destroy them through conventional means. The Americans could do some damage to the nuclear program, installations that are on that are accessible, but those aren't really that important. They can damage certain components of factories that build missiles and drones, but they're not really that important. All the key elements of the peaceful nuclear program or Iran's weapons industry, they're all deep underground. So that I think is important to keep in mind. Second, the former Iranian foreign minister, Dr. Kamal Kharazi, who was the minister during the Khatami administration, he is an advisor to the leader. On two occasions in the last year, and I should be careful, because I'm paraphrasing, but he spoke about the possibility of Iran changing its nuclear posture. And that would come about under the circumstances where Iran is threatened with a nuclear weapon, or perhaps Iran's nuclear capabilities, peaceful nuclear capabilities, are threatened seriously. So the Israelis could, even though they cannot seriously damage the nuclear program, but they could cause Iran to change its nuclear posture. And that would mean leaving the NPT and perhaps moving in the direction of producing a nuclear weapon. And Iran is a threshold state. Iran is one of the 10 to 12 countries that have the most advanced uh, nuclear program. Technologically speaking, for Iran, it would take a very short period of time. Iran has always said that it could have produced a nuclear weapon many years ago if it wanted to. So today it would be very simple for Iran to do so. So the Israeli regime basically, if they do strike Iran's nuclear program, they would be giving Iran an excuse to change its position. And as I said, if it attacks Iran's other military capabilities, it won't really have an impact or a serious impact. They could go for Iran's oil and gas facilities, its refineries, its electrical power plants, and they could cause damage. But Iran has gone through 8 years of war with Iraq, and Iran has experienced decades of sanctions. They will be able to overcome. But what Iran will do in response is, I think, far more consequential for the Israeli regime. The Iranians have already said, as you know, during its previous missile strike, that if the Israeli regime strikes Iran, the Iranian response will be much harder, and that it will destroy or target Israel's key infrastructure. And the Israeli regime is a small regime. It has a small population. Half the population is Palestinian, which is subjugated. It's being suppressed and controlled and killed by the regime. So if Iran harms Israel in a significant way, it will have huge implications for it being able to manage itself. And especially since the people in the surrounding countries are very hostile to the regime. Even in Jordan, people hate Israel. It's only the king of Jordan that is an ally of the regime, and it's because the Americans have kept him in power. But if the regime is weakened, if people see the regime as being weak, then that will encourage them to rise up and to resist against the regime. So I don't think an exchange with Iran would be to the benefit of Israel. I think it would be detrimental to Israel. And then, of course, when Iran responds, Israel will strike again. And Iran will strike again even harsher because Iran has a very large underground missile arsenal and drone arsenal, which, as I said, was created for a war with the United States, not with a small regime like Israel. So Israel cannot come out on top. The only reason why I can justify, let's say, in the eyes of Netanyahu, this escalation is that Netanyahu wants us to somehow draw the Americans into the war. And by creating devastation and by bringing about devastation in Israel, he would be able to convince the Americans to enter the war. But I think that would be devastating for the United States. It would be devastating for the world because the resistance in Iraq has already promised to remove the American presence from Iraq completely and to strike oil and gas assets in the Persian Gulf. That was a statement we saw last night, in fact, again. And the Iranians too, if they see if the Americans get involved in a conflict with Iran, the Iranians have said they'll destroy all American bases in the Persian Gulf region, and those regimes that host those bases will have to pay the price, and that will be the destruction of their infrastructure, which means the destruction of their oil and gas assets, and that would lead to a global economic catastrophe, very different from what we've seen before, and probably significantly worse than 1929. So that's not something that the Americans would want. It would create, I think, I think the Iranians have created a balance of terror with the United States by this deterrence. Everyone would lose in such a war. So I think probably a lot of sane people in Washington won't want to have a direct confrontation with Iran in the United States, between Iran and the United States.
Yeah. It seems that we have some sort of issue with the connection, with the internet connection, but can you hear me right now? Let's see if we can solve the problem. Yeah. Can you hear me,
Sorry,
Professor?
did you hear anything that I said, or did I get cut off a
No,
long
it was
time
the
ago?
last moment that, yeah, it was just the last 30 seconds that it was not that clear to understand. But we got what you've been talking about, and right now, Professor, the same attitude that we've been witnessing in Gaza. They were talking about Al Shifa Hospital tunnels, then Hamas is there, they attack all these hospitals, schools, and everything. They destroyed everything in Gaza. And right now they're talking the same way in Lebanon. it seems that they're talking about Hezbollah stronghold, Hezbollah, everything related to Hezbollah, and they're attacking hospitals, buildings, and civilians. How, in your opinion, are we gonna have the same type of strategy on their part, and we cannot hear and we can hear nothing from the world just condemning what Israel is doing right now in Lebanon, which would be the same outcome as we saw in Gaza?
Yes, you're absolutely correct. I think that when Netanyahu began the genocide in Gaza and he spoke of the Palestinians as Amalek, a biblical allusion to the Amalek tribe that was completely wiped out, including all their animals and children. He was not just alluding to the people of Gaza. He was speaking about not just the people of Palestine, but I think it was very clear that he was speaking about everyone in this region. We are all Amalek in the eyes of the Zionism, and this ethno-supremacist regime uh, sees everyone around it as inferior, and of course, everyone outside of their ideology. And this is nothing really new. It may sound very outrageous, although it is outrageous, but it may sound something unique. But that is how the British Empire, the French Empire, and Western empires behaved for centuries. They considered themselves to be superior. They were Eurocentric, or American exceptionalism itself is the same thing. Therefore, the native populations were always seen as uncivilized, backward, unable to govern themselves, uh, uh, dangerous, uh, and of course, childlike, immature in general. And so this is an extension in many ways of what we've been seeing for centuries. And in fact, what the Israeli regime is doing by carrying out this genocide, both in Gaza and these genocidal attacks in Syria and Lebanon, is I think uh, reviving history in the eyes of people across the global South. Across the global South, when the people watch the genocide taking place, they see their own history. They see their own history being played out in front of their eyes, because they see how they've read about how in their country or their land or in their part of the world, the Western Empire brutalized the population, massacred the population, subjugated the population, enslaved the population, and now they're seeing it happen uh, in front of them, literally, as it is taking place, and that not only has that destroyed the Israeli regime's image across the world and delegitimize it in the eyes of almost everyone. It has also destroyed the image of the West. It has destroyed the uh, the, the West's soft power capabilities. The mask has been removed. People see the West for what it is. It doesn't care about human rights. It doesn't care about women's rights. It doesn't care about freedom of speech. We see how people a child waving a Palestinian flag is arrested in Germany, how a person who speaks is arrested uh, in the UK, another one who's standing in the streets protesting is arrested in France. People are brutalized and beaten across Western countries. People are seeing this now across the global South. So the West, the entire West, is paying a price for what their Zionist allies are doing in Palestine. And I have no doubt that the Western political establishment will continue to support the Israeli regime, and so will their media, whether it's state media like the BBC, or whether it's legacy media that's owned by billionaires, CNN, Fox News, it doesn't matter, or The Guardian or The Washington Post. It doesn't matter if they're liberal or right. conservative, they're all going to back the Israeli regime until the last Palestinian, until the last Lebanese child is killed. This narrative will continue. They will continue to try to justify the atrocities. They'll continue to try to blame the victim, because this is what they've been doing for centuries. This is how empire has always justified itself. This is how the French justified the occupation of Algeria, and during the liberation movement in Algeria, some say up to 2 million people were slaughtered by the French, but ultimately they gained their independence. If you look at Iran, in 1953, when the Americans carried out the coup and they overthrew Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, if you look at the New York Times and other mainstream media in the United States, they were all hostile to Mohammad Mossadegh. They called him a zealot, an extremist, a madman, and they justified the coup. And now that he's gone and he's been dead for many decades, they praise him because he's no longer a threat. But now they use the same language against the Islamic Republic of Iran, that they're zealots, that they're dangerous, that they're madmen, that they're crazy, that they're oppressive. Why? Because they're standing up against the Western Empire. But as I was saying earlier on, the world has changed. People are now seeing the world through social media, even though it's controlled by the West and we're all being censored. I've been removed from Instagram. I've been removed from Facebook. All I have left is a Twitter account, which is probably shadow banned in some way or form. But people are seeing things very differently now. They see, and the West is on the decline. Its capabilities are declining. So in the past, this had more effect. Now it has much less effect. So while the West will continue to support Israel, and they will continue to provide the weapons to slaughter and to kill, and the Western media will try to justify what's going on and say that these are Hezbollah strongholds, as you pointed out, or these are Hamas strongholds. Ordinary cities like the city you are in, the city I am in, where people live, when it comes to Israel's adversaries, they'll call them strongholds to legitimize strikes against civilian targets, or Hezbollah sites, or alleged Hezbollah sites, and that sort of language. But I don't think it's going to work this time. The region is in uproar. The Americans speak about their Arab allies. Their Arab allies are in serious trouble because people are getting increasingly outraged by what's going on in Palestine. And what the Israelis have actually done is that they've strengthened unity among the Shias and the Sunnis for decades. The West and Israel have been trying to divide the region through race, through sectarianism. They use Wahhabis in particular alongside Saudi Arabia to create massive divisions. During the Syrian Dirty War, they were particularly effective in using sectarianism. These oil-rich dictatorships were doing it. The West was doing it. They were supporting ISIS and Al Qaeda and the Jaish al-Islam, and many people in the region were fooled by their narratives, and they supported the dirty war in Syria. I think what they've done now in Lebanon, in Gaza, and against Syria has shown most people across the region and beyond that these divisions are meaningless and that the West has been manipulating them. I've just returned from Turkey. I was at a major conference on the anniversary of October the 7th, and the mood has changed completely between the different groups, and the different people are now much more united than before. People who before were criticizing Hezbollah and Iran are now praising Iran and Hezbollah. Hamas and Islamic Jihad have become increasingly popular. Hezbollah has become extremely popular. So while they are murdering people, while they're slaughtering people, but what on the other hand, what they're doing inadvertently is that they're uniting everyone against them. So they're not. So for the first few months, they've been creating this anger and outrage, and now they're also causing, because Hezbollah and Ansarullah in Yemen and Iran and the Iraqis and Syria have been the only ones supporting the Palestinians. They are bringing the Sunni population in the region and the Shia population and others all together into one front. So the Israelis may call that a victory. The West may say the Israeli regime is winning. But in my opinion, they have destroyed over 4 decades of hard work to create hatred and animosity and mistrust across people among people uh, across the region.
And you talk about Turkey, and we know that Erdogan was talking about that Israel is a Zionist terrorist organization recently. Do you think this type of rhetoric on his part, do you think that is the public opinion that is putting pressure on him to talk this way, or he's changing his mind at the end of the day?
I think public opinion is putting a lot of pressure on him. One thing that I've noticed in Turkey is that people are not happy with him and his policies on Palestine. And the same people who in the past, some my own friends, were criticizing Iran and Hezbollah over Syria, now they recognize what the truth was in Syria and the destructive role that President Erdogan played in Syria. And now they see that he was willing to back then support these groups, ISIS and Al Qaeda, and he still does support Al Qaeda in Idlib. But he hasn't done anything for the Palestinians or for Gaza or for Lebanon, and he still allows oil to flow, cheap oil to flow from Baku um, to the Israeli regime, and he allows Turkish trade to go to Israel indirectly, and business to continue. So people are upset, even those who have always supported him, uh, at least those who I know, they are not happy, and they say that that is the same true across the board, and the same is true elsewhere, and among others. But that's just one example. Imagine how it is in Jordan. Imagine how it is in Egypt. Imagine how it is in Saudi Arabia and um, in these small countries in the Persian Gulf and elsewhere. This rage is building, and so what these governments and these regimes are doing is that they are alongside the delegitimization of Israel, they're delegitimizing their own position by remaining neutral or effectively supporting the Israeli regime. I don't think this is sustainable, especially because it's become clear that the Israelis cannot win. They will not be able to open the Red Sea. The Americans have tried for a year and they failed against Yemen. Hezbollah, we've seen since the battles began on the border that they've uh, caused huge damage to the Israelis, and the Israelis have failed to make any meaningful progress in Lebanon. And we were predicting this earlier on when they assassinated Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah. Uh, I said to many people on different shows that I think Hezbollah will become stronger because Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah will become more popular. Hezbollah will become more popular, and we see that today. And Hezbollah as a force, it has been untouched. True, they've murdered people, assassinated people in Beirut, but Beirut has always, as I said before, been the weakest link for Hezbollah. That's where all the Western intelligence agencies, embassies, NGOs, journalists, and others have always been active, even before Hezbollah was created. But across the country, they have thousands of kilometers of underground facilities and tunnels, and those are untouched. And now we're seeing how they are inflicting great pain to the Israelis, and simultaneously, the Israelis have failed to quell the resistance in the West Bank and to take Gaza. So the longer this lasts, the more difficult it is going to be for Netanyahu. And that is why Netanyahu wants to escalate with Iran and bring Iran in. But by doing that, we don't know if the Americans are willing to do the crazy thing and enter the war and devastate the global economy, and B, it is only going to destabilize the region further. If the United States attacks Iran and Iran strikes the infrastructure of those countries, those regimes that host U.S. bases, those regimes will fall, and so will all the regimes in the region. It will, not only will tens of millions of people be on the move, but also those regimes will change. And then how will that affect Israelis who have surrounded them with pro-American dictatorships? If those regimes are swept away, what happens to the security of Israel's borders? So the longer this goes on, the worse it becomes for Israel. This is indeed, as the Chinese say, death by 1,000 cuts. So they can keep massacring and pretend, and every now and then kill a Hezbollah officer or a Hamas commander, but it's not going to change anything.
Yeah. If you look at this photo here, it's a Israeli finance minister with a map at a podium. You look at this map. If you may wonder, what does it mean? It means Palestine, Jordan, it goes to Saudi Arabia, to Syria. Do you think when these Arab states look at this map, does it concern them? Because at the end of the day, it's so dangerous, the concept of greater Israel. And they have to think to find a permanent solution for the conflict in Gaza. But it doesn't seem that they're getting to that level of seriousness when it comes to Israel and its behavior.
Well, I think these Arab regimes, what they've done, their elites, is that they're taking as much money as they can, and probably when the time comes, they'll be the first to leave the country, and they'll reside in the United States. So I don't think they are going to do anything about this. They will continue to, the current regimes will continue to close their eyes to reality for as long as they can keep their eyes closed. However, what this shows to the people of the region is that the Israeli regime is a colony that wants to continue to expand, and they are expanding as we speak. They are taking more land in Al-Quds or Jerusalem. They are taking more land in the West Bank. This has nothing to do with Gaza, but the land grab continues, and it has increased in pace over the last few years. So they have ambitions over Lebanon, and they only by exposing themselves like this, they only legitimize Hezbollah's actions even more, because Hezbollah not only is it showing its moral response that it's morally bound to protecting the Palestinian people, but it's also showing that the people across the world that Hezbollah is also defending itself, because it has to be strong in order to protect Lebanese territory. We know that the United States will never allow, and the West will never allow, Lebanon to be strong. Lebanon has no air force. Lebanon has no anti-aircraft defense capability. Why? Because it's not allowed. The United States simply will not allow it to happen. Neither will Europe. Why? Because they want to make sure that the Israeli regime can bomb and attack and invade Lebanon whenever it wants. The same is true with Jordan. The same is true with Syria. The whole dirty war in Syria, against Syria, was to overthrow the government so that Israel will no longer feel that it's threatened by a powerful neighbor or an alliance of neighbors that are a part of the axis of resistance. So again, I think that this shows the stupidity of the Israeli regime. That these uh, these maps, these statements show that the Israelis, contrary to what the Americans have always been saying and the Europeans contrary to what the Europeans have always been saying, that the Israelis know the region well. The Israelis don't know the region well, because if they did, if they were smart, they wouldn't be continuing this genocidal war. They wouldn't allow their ministers to be making these statements and to print these maps. This war would have, if they were smart, if the Israeli regime was smart, if it was genocidal and smart, they would have bombed Gaza for a month after October the 7th, and they would have gone on with the lies about beheadings and rapes and all that. And the Western media, of course, would have gone with that. And then they would have ended the war and said, okay, we punished Hamas and it's over. Those lies about rapes and beheadings would have remained intact. They could have scored let's say, a political victory in the eyes of, with the help of Western media and Western propaganda, but they went on and on and on with this genocide. And now everything is coming out. People are learning more and more about Zionism, about Israel, about the history, about the ambitions of this colony. And so, again, I think the Israelis are themselves helping to bring Netanyahu. I think is the greatest enemy of the Israeli regime, because I think he is the one, despite all the genocide, he is the one who is going to ultimately cause the regime to collapse. It may not collapse in 6 months or a year, but I think we are in the dying period of Zionism in our part of the world.
Can the president of Iran, Pezeshkian, together with Erdogan, bring some sort of coalition among the the Arab states and Iran together with Turkey? Is that possible, in your opinion, with the new government in Iran, with Erdogan, the way that he's talking about the conflict in Gaza? We know the behavior of Arab states, how they're talking the talk, they're not doing anything.
I am very pessimistic about Erdogan. I don't think that he or any of the Arab regimes in the region have any intention of doing anything against Israel. They've already had the opportunity many times. Just recently, Erdogan said if Israel attacks Lebanon, we will have to go to their support, but they haven't. He hasn't done anything. I don't take anything that he says seriously, but the uh, the populations across the region, as I said earlier, their mood has changed. And in the case of Turkey, it's more complicated because it is a somewhat democratic system, and Erdogan has a democratic legitimacy. Moral legitimacy is another issue, but he has a democratic legitimacy. But in the other countries in the region, they don't have that popular legitimacy, let's call it. Uh, they don't, whether they're democratic or not is I mean, I don't believe there any democracy exists in the world today. This is just an empty word. I don't believe the United States or Europeans are democratic, but that's another discussion. But the Arab countries in the region, I don't think they have popular legitimacy, and therefore, the biggest question for me is that will they remain stable? Because the longer the world war lasts, the more destabilizing it will be for the region as a whole. And I gave this example before, I think, uh, going back to Tunisia, before the Arab Spring, everything seemed quiet across the world, across the Arab world. But then one young man burned himself alive because of uh, a local injustice that was done to him. It brought down the Tunisian regime, and then it brought down the most important country in the Arab world, the regime in the most important country in the Arab world, and that's Egypt. So today the situation is much more dangerous. The West is much more vulnerable. It's much weaker than it was a decade and a half ago because of Ukraine, because of uh, the the wars that they uh, carried on in Afghanistan and elsewhere after those years. So the United States today is much weaker, and it doesn't have the sort of power to control as it did before, and the outrage and anger across the Arab world is much greater. I cannot make predictions, but I think that Israel is in a very dangerous situation, and as things stand, the Israelis obviously are not going to win a war. If they strike Iran, Iran will strike back. If they strike Iran again, Iran will strike back harder. Every time the Israelis strike, Iran will strike them back harder. Iran is much larger. Israel is much smaller. And if the Americans enter, as I said, it would create a global economic catastrophe. If they don't enter, then Netanyahu is in a dead end again. And I think as Israel gets hit every time, it's only going to show it as being weaker. And that is only going to encourage resistance against Israel, whether it's among the axis of resistance or whether it's among people in countries in the region that are allied to the West. It will encourage them to move against Israel. And that, I think, will mean that the regimes will be increasingly in trouble.
As you mentioned, in Gaza, they couldn't defeat Hamas. Right now, in with Hezbollah, they're talking about they want to send their people to the northern part of Israel. That's why they're going on the ground in Lebanon to make some sort of buffer zone, just pushing Hezbollah to the Litani River. But we know the capabilities of Hezbollah, and they're capable of attacking each and every point in Israel. And does it make sense, in your opinion, the way that they're thinking in their mind?
No, the Israelis already invaded Lebanon before. And in 1982, they invaded the country and reached Beirut in 4 or 5 days, which I think this itself is very revealing, that now after more than 2 weeks of heavy fighting, they have been unable to get anywhere in southern Lebanon. Whereas in 1982, they took the southern half of the country in 5 days, in 4 days or 5 days. And back then, though, Hezbollah didn't exist. And it was as a result of that occupation that Hezbollah was created. And Hezbollah, as a small fighting force, gradually grew and expelled the Israeli regime from Lebanon. And that was an Israeli regime that was much stronger than it is today. And the West back then was much stronger than it is today. So already we're seeing the Israelis fail on the border. If this continues for weeks and months, it's only going to weaken the regime, whereas they still have to confront the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. It's going to further delegitimize them and the West across the world. And all of this is happening simultaneously as Russia is advancing in Ukraine. So the West is constantly throwing everything they have.
Yeah, you're back.
Okay, I hope I'm back permanently this time.
Yeah, yeah, I hope so. And let's go with the answer that you've been giving us in order to their end game in Lebanon, as they were talking, because we were talking about they want to make a buffer zone in the southern part of Lebanon, while we know the capabilities of Hezbollah, and you were to answer that question, which you can give us the answer right now.
Yes, what I just wanted to add was that Hezbollah today is much stronger than it was between 1982 and the year 2000 when they finally forced the Israeli regime to withdraw. And Hezbollah's capabilities across southern Lebanon are enormous and extensive, and they're all underground. And the Israeli regime has no idea where they are. Once they advance, the deeper they go into Lebanon, the more vulnerable they become. Right now, they're stuck at the border. If they gradually move in 10 kilometers, then let's say, or 15 kilometers, they will be hit from all sides. And Hezbollah is not Hamas. Hezbollah is not Islamic Jihad. So the Israeli regime cannot sustain this. And I think, as I was saying earlier, I think Netanyahu knows this. I don't believe that Netanyahu thinks he can win. I don't think Netanyahu believes that he can take a buffer zone in Lebanon and keep it. His objective is to keep the war going, to stay in power. And in order to keep the war going, he has to expand the war gradually when it doesn't make any real progress. So ultimately, he will have to go after Iran. And I think that even there, he knows that he cannot win, being a much smaller regime. His only hope is to bring in the Americans. This is all about bringing in the Americans. And I think that's why I personally think that the Americans will have to remove Netanyahu, either through some sort of political coup or through one of those Trump assassinations or something like that. He is going to have to maybe fall asleep at night and not wake up in the morning. Otherwise, this is going to just get worse for the Israeli regime. Carrying out genocide is not victory. Killing a few leaders is not victory. You can kill 10 Iranian generals. You can murder a president, a speaker of parliament. You can murder the leader. It's not going to change anything because, contrary to how the West views the world or our part of the world, the axis of resistance is not dependent on individuals. It is these are sophisticated countries and sophisticated organizations full of highly educated people, highly motivated people, and they will continue to function. And we saw that in Lebanon. They said that they decapitated Hezbollah. They murdered a few commanders and the leader. Then what? Right now, then it should be they should have an easy victory over Hezbollah in the south. That's not happening. Again, I would always call on your viewers to compare 1982, to look at it. I never advise people to use Wikipedia, but to compare 1982 through, let's say, Wikipedia or some other short history, read some other short history of the 1982 invasion and compare it to the last couple of weeks since the entrance of since the Israelis tried to enter Lebanon, and see the enormous difference that exists between the two, despite the fact that Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah was martyred, despite the fact that a number of commanders and officials were assassinated and murdered by the Israeli regime. The difference between 1982 and now is extraordinary. And therefore, again, I think this is all falls within that framework of death by a thousand cuts. The Israeli regime is tiring itself out, is delegitimizing itself further in global public opinion and including in Western public opinion. No one is ever going to invest in this regime again. No one is ever going to bring in large amounts of capital to Israel. Many people will start leaving Israel. Many of the elites, many of the smart and educated people will leave. And people across the region will be emboldened because they're seeing how vulnerable the regime is, contrary to the image that it created for itself in the past, that it was somehow invincible and that it could overpower any force standing against it. The 200 or so missiles that the Iranians fired at Israel also shattered its image. They all got through this Iron Dome and all the elaborate defense mechanisms, not just but the American system, because the American system is much more advanced and much more elaborate than the Israeli system. It got through all of them. And
Yeah.
sorry, Nima, I think in future we'll have to use a different application.
For sure. Yeah, I totally understand that. And Professor Marandi, do you think right now we had the foreign minister of Iran talking with the crown prince of Saudi Arabia recently? And what do we know about the talks that they have been doing during this meeting?
Well, Iran and Saudi Arabia, and sorry because I couldn't hear you well, Iran and Saudi Arabia have been removing many of the obstacles in their relationship. But I also think that what I was saying earlier is relevant here as well. The weaker the Israeli regime looks, the more vulnerable it looks, the less the countries of the region put their faith in the West. When the Americans and the West, despite all their efforts, are unable to prop up the Israeli regime, and the regime is increasingly despised, and it is unable to achieve victories in the region, then I think countries like Saudi Arabia and others become more worried about their position in the region, and they become more worried about their over reliance on the West. So the longer the war lasts, even though many of these regimes are bound to the West, they become more concerned, and they try to start finding ways to protect themselves. So the longer the war lasts, I think the weaker the West looks, the weaker Israel looks, and that makes normalization with the Israeli regime look less appealing. It makes those countries that normalize with the Israeli regime look more foolish, and it makes the need to improve ties with Iran or Russia or China or other non-Western countries more appealing.
Yeah. And right now we know that President Pezeshkian gonna talk with Putin for the first time. And how do you see the current policies of the new government in Iran? Because when he came into power, many people were doubtful about what he's gonna do. Is he gonna go toward BRICS? Is he gonna change the policies in Iran in terms of the foreign policy of Iran? What can we say right now about his posture, his way of thinking?
If I understood correctly, if you're asking whether President Pezeshkian will shift Iranian foreign policy, or if he has an incentive to do so.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think the actions of the United States and Israel and Europe have actually destroyed that attempt, if there ever was one, because President Pezeshkian, as soon as during his inauguration, one of his guests was assassinated by the Israeli regime while he was in an Iranian guest house. And not only did Western countries not condemn the assassination, they supported it at the UN Security Council. Not only did they not condemn the Israeli regime, they supported the Israeli regime. So those people who were hoping for some sort of rapprochement with the West, and we all want normalization with the West, but those who were perhaps a bit more optimistic for some sort of rapprochement, they were slapped in the face by the Europeans and the Americans. And then, of course, the genocide itself, the ongoing genocide, the expansion of the genocide, the claim that the West was trying to bring about a ceasefire, which turned out to be a lie. The president said that we waited for a ceasefire, and that's why we held off our strike against Israel. But there was no ceasefire. It was never a serious. There were never any real serious negotiation. So when the West lies about a ceasefire, how can Iran trust the West at the negotiating table? When the West supports the assassination of official Iranian guests, how can Iran move towards rapprochement? So I think it actually not only diminishes any hope for rapprochement, but I think it justifies the Iranian government position to take a hard stance against the West, because the Iranian government has shown the public that we tried, but these people are not reasonable. These people, they will support bombing our embassies. They'll support bombing, killing our guests. They lied about a ceasefire. So when President Pezeshkian speaks about rapprochement and the West slaps him in the face, then that only strengthens his hand when he tells people, I tried, but it was useless, and therefore we have to be steadfast against the West. And it only strengthens his position when he strengthens ties with Russia and China, because people will say, well, He tried with the West, and the West did the same thing that they did to the previous president, Dr. Raisi, and that was nothing. So today he will have talks with President Putin or he's having talks with President Putin in Turkmenistan, and I think that the behavior of the West will only uh, help push forward the relationship between Russia and Iran further. And I think in the upcoming talks in Kazan between the BRICS heads of state, that will also, what we're seeing in Palestine and the behavior that the Europeans and the West and the United States have shown towards Iran, will also help President Pezeshkian to, or encourage President Pezeshkian and justify President Pezeshkian when he enhances relations with BRICS member states, including China and Russia, among others.
Just to wrap up this session, do you think that for Iran, does it matter who's going to win in 2024 presidential election? We know that how they're trying to manipulate everything. They're trying to say that Iran is behind the assassination of Donald Trump, these attempts that they want to assassinate Donald Trump. But at the end of the day, when you look at the way that Iran is thinking of the domestic and foreign policy of the United States, does it matter who's going to be in power in the United States?
No, not at all. After what Biden and Harris effectively have done and said over Gaza and Lebanon and Syria and Yemen, I think it's become clear to everyone that Trump is no different. Trump may bark louder, but when after Trump murdered General Soleimani, who led the fight against ISIS and Al Qaeda, after he threatened Iran if Iran struck back, and Iran destroyed the U.S. Al-Assad airbase in Iraq, and Iran destroyed U.S. facilities there, and Trump did not respond. And I think that showed that Trump knew that the Iranians were dead serious. I don't think that there would be any major difference between Trump and Harris. Both support the genocide. Trump would probably be worse for the United States because he would, in certain respects, because many countries across the world, many governments don't like him, including the Europeans. And he is a very divisive figure inside the United States. So there could be more internal difficulties for the United States and difficulties with allies. I don't think Trump will be able to bring about an end to the war in Ukraine either, because the Russians have made too many sacrifices for them to give Trump any serious concessions. And if Trump gives Russia what it demands, then he will be seen as humiliated and weak. So I don't see any real difference between the two, and probably Trump will be worse for the United States than Harris, although both of them are pretty awful anyway.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being with us today, and great pleasure as always talking with you.